Hey peeps, welcome all. So yeah, good to see that we've already got some people joined us, which is good. Apologies for the kind of reschedule. Yeah, both Justin and I weren't well enough to go ahead with the stream with all the colds and COVIDs and going around, but we're here. Got some awesome stuff to show you today. Hopefully a few more people join us, but yeah. What else? Yeah, I think next time around, so this is our 14th Ableton user group Adelaide session. This is our second live stream. We'd love to do more, and would really love some content from the users. So please get in touch with us with some ideas of what you might want to present, and it can literally be anything, something that interests you to do with, it doesn't even necessarily have to be related to Ableton. Obviously, you know, awesome if it is, but if it's something more related to music production or music industry, then yeah, that would be awesome too. So get in touch if you do have something you'd like to present, and we can talk about whether it's for one of these live stream events or whether it's for an in-person event. So the next Ableton user group event is likely to be in person, and hopefully we have some push threes that we can yeah, let you guys have a play with. So without further ado, we might get started in the first kind of segment, which is a video I did on synthesizing with Drift. So yeah, let us know if you've been playing with Drift in the comments, and yeah, if you've got any questions throughout this entire stream, just pop them in there, and we'll have some time at the end of the stream to answer some questions. But yeah, hope you enjoy. Hey peeps, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Live's new instrument, Drift, which is now available in all versions of Live. And once you've updated Live to the latest version, you'll have it there waiting for you. There's already other videos out there going through Drift in more detail, so I'm going to do something a little bit different and show you the possibilities of Drift by making an entire track, crossing a few different genres, using nothing but Drift. To start off with, I'll briefly go through the different parts of Drift, then we'll look at the individual sounds, and then I'll play through the entire piece of music that I've put together. So one thing that makes Drift quite interesting is the unique oscillator shapes. And there's 7 in total for the main oscillator. Each of them have a shape control, which allows you to change the harmonics of that sound. So the first one is a sine wave with a wave folder. Second one is a triangle with a wave folder. Third one is kind of like a triangle that morphs into a saw wave. So it's a little bit brighter than a normal triangle. Then the fourth one is half sine, half triangle that gets driven into a clipper. Then there's a saw wave with sync. Then there's quite an interesting one. It's a bright pulse that morphs into what looks like a rectified sine with sync. So that's quite an interesting shape. And then the last one is a square wave where the shape parameter changes the pulse width. Then there's a sub-oscillator with a detune parameter and a dedicated noise oscillator. If you need extra oscillators, you can always group Drift into an instrument rack and use 2 instances of it. So you can have as many oscillators as you want, and then use macros to control the common synth parameters. And I've done that a couple of times in my example, which I'll show you. Next is the filters and envelopes. So there's one low pass filter and one high pass filter. Now the low pass filter has 2 types, a 12 decibel per octave and a 24 decibel per octave. And the high pass filter is resonant. So it's a 2-pole filter or 12 decibel per octave with a little bit of resonance. It would be kind of nice to be able to adjust the high pass resonance, but you can kind of use it to your advantage, and I'll show you that in my examples. One thing that's really interesting about the filter is that it can be modulated at audio rate, which is quite rare. This is something I really like to do in modular synthesis because it gives quite a unique tone. So definitely try that out, and I'll show you that in my examples. There are 2 dedicated modulation slots. So in the picture here, you can see that it's kind of pre-mapped to pressure, and LFO, but these can be changed to all sorts of different sources. There's also key tracking for the low pass filter, so you can play the filter on the keyboard. There's two ADSR envelopes. They always have linear attack and exponential decay and release, which is pretty typical of an analog synthesizer. But envelope 2 can become a looping attack hold decay envelope that can go all the way up to audio rates. So incredibly useful, and I haven't really found any limitations in terms of modulation with drift. Occasionally I'd use an LFO to modulate something, like Live's native Max for Live LFO, but for 90% of the sounds I made, and I made a lot, I could get away with just the modulation that was inside drift. Which brings us to LFO modulation. So the LFO can do audio rate modulation, so you could use the LFO to modulate the rate of the filter, or the pitch of the oscillator, so it can do FM. There's also a dedicated modulator for the amount, as you can see here. So there's a few sources for that. And the shapes are quite interesting. So you've got all the basics: sine, tri, saw up, saw down, square, sample and hold, which is like random, wander, which is interpolated noise. So it's noise that's been smoothed over. And I'm pretty sure that's what's being used for the drift parameter, which we'll look at later. Then there's also linear envelope and exponential envelope, which is an additional envelope that you can apply to things like pitch to make things nice and plucky, or to very quickly map it to oscillator volume to get a more percussive type sound. Not shown on this screen is the mod matrix, which allows you to make 3 selections from 8 sources and 11 destinations. So as I mentioned, tons of modulation. Another thing where it gets interesting, the voice modes. The first 2 are pretty normal. Poly is just polyphonic voice mode, allows you to play multiple notes at a time, up to 32 voices, which is quite good. Mono is 1 note at a time, but this parameter here allows you to blend in the additional voices, adding thickness. So things can sound quite fat when that is up 100%. Stereo is similar to poly, but it adds additional voices that are panned, and then this parameter controls the width. Then there's unison, which again adds additional voices, but this time with detuning rather than panning. And this can make sounds really big. Then you've got the drift parameter. So this is one of the things that gives drift its unique character, and it basically adds very slow modulation to the pitch of the oscillators and the filter cutoff for all the voices. And this is something that would typically happen in an analog synthesizer. Now I'll go through each of these sounds individually and show you a little bit about how they were created, and then we'll listen to the overall example. So this first one is a kick drum. And you can see that I've used a little bit of the second envelope to change the shape, just adding some extra harmonics to the start of that sound. I've also got key tracking on, so it's kind of playing the filter and has helped pronouncing the fundamental with a little bit of resonance. And I'm also using that second envelope on the filter, as well as the pitch over here to give it that pluckiness. So I could use these envelopes here instead, but yeah, I decided to use the second envelope for the modulation on this particular sound. And of course, because it's a percussive type instrument, I've used a mono voice mode. On most of these sounds, I tried to use pretty minimal processing, and initially I wanted to make it so that I could share this project, but I got a little bit excited and ended up using quite a few of my own Max for Live devices. So what I'll do instead is save each of these instruments into a preset and share the presets with everyone. So the second sound is a bass sound. And I used 2 instances of drift here, so I'll solo the first one. Now I'm using a little bit of envelope 2 on the pitch to just add a bit more punch to this bass sound. I've got 2 oscillators, one's a square wave and one's a sine wave, which has a little bit of wave folding on it. And I am modulating the filter a little bit. And then this one is that interesting shape I mentioned earlier. And together, Sounds pretty cool, I think. Then I've got this little wub that I just kind of threw in there. Thought I needed it, so that's some couple of sine waves, and one of which I'm modulating the shape, or automating the shape. Then I've got a snare, which actually turned out quite good. So I've got a little bit of envelope modulation on the shape and also on the pitch, and I'm using a triangle oscillator for that. I've also used the high pass filter to pronounce the fundamental of the snare. So I mentioned earlier that it is kind of resonant. You can see there's a bump there, and sometimes that adds a little bit of boxiness to a synth, but here it's actually perfect for a snare. So quite happy with that one, and I can definitely see myself using that more often. Then I've got a pretty simple noise hat. So it's really just a noise oscillator being driven into the filter with very short envelopes. Then I've got another hat which is quite similar to the previous one, but I've added an oscillator in here to try and get some more metallic tones, and that's using that interesting oscillator shape there. So when I automate the decay parameter, it does sound a little bit more metallic. So it kind of works a little bit, you know, cymbal-like. Then I've got this zappy type sound. So this is a square wave with pulse width modulation, and then resonance absolutely cranked with envelope 2 controlling the filter frequency to make it really plucky. So if I turn the resonance down, it's not quite as interesting. You can see I've got lots of drift, and I've also got the stereo voice mode cranked a little bit as well, and I'm modulating the decay of this. So that worked in this context. So all of those sounds together. I won't play too much, we'll keep going through these synth sounds. So this next one is an arpeggiator. And I've got a chord effect on the input so that it's playing a perfect fifth for every note that's coming in. And then I do automate a delay echo to kind of add some variation to my pattern. With this one, there's a little bit less modulation. I'm using the triangle to saw waveform with a bit of shape. And the second oscillator, I've pitched down an octave and then a perfect fifth again. It's quite a fat sound. And then I've just got a little bit of envelope on the filter modulation. If I turn off these effects so you can hear it on its own, still pretty cool. Then I've got a simple lead. So just this wave shape with a little bit of shape modulation from the LFO. I'm using this in unison mode. That's pretty much it for that one. It's playing an octave above. And if we play those together, pretty cool. We'll keep moving along. This time around I've got a pad. I'll turn off these effects. So a little bit of LFO modulating the shape of a triangle. And then for the second oscillator, I've got this particular wave shape. Not too much other modulation going on. Bit of drift. I've found that 20% is kind of my sweet spot, or at least it was for this particular project. Using this in unison mode. Yeah, that's pretty much it for this sound. With the effects. So I've got some reverb and some auto pan that I'm modulating. Then if we listen to those together. So I'll move on to the next section, next bunch of sounds. This time around, I went a little bit more movie score-ish, cinematic or ambient. And this first sound, I wanted something similar to a violin. So I tried to create that, which I think worked relatively well. I've got a bit of LFO on the shape parameter for that triangle to saw wave shape. Quite a lot of attack on this second envelope, which I'm using to control the amount of the LFO modulation. So as the note is sustained, it gets a little bit more modulation, kind of like if you were bowing a violin. So if we have a listen to that. I think it sounds relatively convincing as a violin, so that's pretty cool. Then this sound here, which was probably my favorite. For this one, it's a little bit of noise. It's a detuned sub-oscillator and using the triangle to saw wave shape, which is probably one of my favorites. Not too much modulation, except for the envelope modulating the filter. And you can hear that one here. So very nice, sounds quite analogy, and I'm using that in the stereo voice mode. Next, I've got this bass sound. Which sounds great. I'm using that in unison mode and all three oscillators again. I've got key tracking on the filter and using LFO to modulate the filter frequency, but the LFO is going at audio rate. So rather than a 1-to-1 pitch, it's kind of slightly detuned, and yeah, fattens up the sound quite a bit. If I turn this down, still pretty cool, but with it up. Definitely adds some gnarliness to it. And again, the LFO amount is being modulated by this second envelope. So yeah, very cool sound, that one. And then also in this section, I wanted something kind of plucky and sparse and bright. So I made something that I called sparkles. And that is using mostly sine waves, but I'm using the exponential envelope for the LFO. And I've got that mapped to the shape parameter of the first oscillator. So I'll just turn off some effects so you can hear it a little bit better. So it sounds average like that, but in context of the track with the effects. So I've got a grain delay, bandpass filter, and some echo, saturation, and EQ. So all of that added in there. It creates these sparse bell-like tones, which fit this example quite well. So we listen to all of that stuff together. Pretty nice, very lush. Then I go into some techno type sounds. So I tried my hand at making another kick, and you can hear it here. It's not bad. So I used the exponential envelope from the LFO, and that's mapped to the pitch. Then I've also got the second envelope modulating the filter a bit as well to kind of just take off a little bit of the top end, make it a little bit more kick-like. Now I do have some effects on here, so my Devolve Dramatics is like a multi-effects unit. So if I turn that off, definitely sounds a little bit more 909-ish. Then I've got a shaker type sound. So I'm using the high pass filter and the low pass filter together to create a kind of bandpass filter that is somewhat centered around 7.5K. And this is the type of sound that I would use a lot in my music. And that works quite well. Then I've got this FM stab. So this is the kind of thing I would normally do with operator. And drift definitely doesn't replace operator for me. They have quite different tonalities, and there's all sorts of options in operator with the choice of harmonics and also having 4 operators. But drift can definitely do FM and it sounds quite different. And I'm doing the kind of thing that I would normally do in operator. So just using sine waves and yeah, one modulating another. There is a little bit of envelope modulation on the shape of this oscillator as well to add a little bit more pluckiness to it. That sound works quite well. Then I've got this main lead for the techno part. And again, I'm using 2 layers. So the first one is using some FM as well that is slightly detuned. I've got some noise in there and envelope 2 modulating the filter. And that's in mono mode. So I've turned that up a bit to give it some thickness. Then the second layer, but some different wave shapes. And then together, I think that sounds pretty good. And that's the type of sound that I would expect from something like my MFB Craftswerk that I have in Eurorack. Then I've got a stab here. So a very simple dub techno type sound, using the stereo voice mode with quite a lot of drift, a little bit of LFO modulation on the shape and playing some chords. And I've got a few filters that are sweeping around as well as some echo. So if I turn those off, it's just a nice plucky chord really. And lastly, I've got this string. So I used square wave oscillators with some pulse width modulation, a little bit of detuning, and I'm using the Wander LFO to modulate the shape. That's also in unison mode, and that sounds like this. Very nice string sound, I think. So all of those sounds together. So I had a lot of fun coming up with all these sounds, and I've definitely learnt a lot more about drift in the process. These are my kind of tips when using drift. Now, just note that I did not use any MPE features whatsoever, and each of these sounds are still quite expressive and have a lot of modulation and sound quite interesting. And a lot of that comes down to the drift, the voice modes, and the detuning of those oscillators. So my first tip is to use the designated modulation on the front panel that are near particular parameters. So you saw how I used that on the pitch for the oscillators, the cutoff for the low pass filter, and the amount for the modulation. And doing that just speeds up programming. Because the modulation matrix is hidden and those modulation parameters are right there in front of you, it makes more sense to reach for those first. Perhaps you're creating a sound and dialing things in using the front panel, and then using the mod matrix for setting up some MPE expression, which makes perfect sense because there's 3 selectors for that. So as I mentioned, the LFO can do audio rate modulation of the frequency, of the filter, and of the oscillator volumes as well. So you can do some amplitude modulation, and they can give some really gritty tones if you're looking for something a little bit different. And that's something that you can't often do, especially in the other synths in live. Another thing I found is that with very high drift values, things can go very out of tune. So because that pitch modulation is very slow, you might be playing a synth and then you notice, hang on, this doesn't sound right. And that's because the synth has gone out of tune and it might come back in tune later. So just be aware of that if things are sounding a little bit funny when you're playing a synth alongside other instruments, it might be that you've gone a little bit too far with the drift. Overall, drift sounds very lush. It can be quite bright without being harsh. and definitely has a kind of softness to it. A lot of these sounds, I tried to really push it to get some edge out of it. And as you heard, I somewhat succeeded. And any edge that I didn't get, I got something that I liked anyway. Now, I think it definitely excels at things like pads, but it can also do really good leads and basses. And as you heard, it was okay for drums. That snare was great. But when I tried making kicks in different ways, like pinging the filter, I did run into some issues. But for the most part, it is a very capable synth that you can make entire tracks out of, without a doubt. Now, one thing that I first found quite interesting with drift and I wasn't sure about was how when you turn up the oscillators quite loud, they overdrive the filter and it changes the sound. Sometimes it can make it sound a little bit tubby. On closer inspection, it kind of looks like it's clipping those oscillators a little bit when it gets to the filter. And yeah, sometimes I like the sound of it, sometimes I don't. So remember that if you're happy with the sound, reach for the master volume rather than turning up the oscillators, so you don't mess with the tone that you've currently got. So in a moment, I'll play through the full example, but I'd love to hear your experiences with drift. And if you've got any questions, please chuck them in the comments. I'll be keeping an eye on those, and there should be something in the description for links to the presets. So let's have a listen. And that's drift. So I hope you liked my example. Thanks for listening. If you've got any questions about this project, just throw them in the comments and I'll get back to you at some point. As I mentioned, I'll be sharing these presets. Look out for that in the description. Definitely update live and try drift for yourself. It is awesome. When I do get a push 3 of my own, I will do another video talking a little bit more about MPE and getting expressiveness into instruments. But for now, thanks for watching. See you again soon. Awesome. Yeah, thanks for all your comments in there, people. I had a lot of fun doing that video segment. Not quite sure if I'm going to split that into 3 different tracks or what, but yeah, very much enjoyed the result and I'll probably do something with it. The presets I've shared the link in the event discussion, also in the comments. I'll kind of show you briefly what they look like. So let's do this. So I've just got them here in my user library. It basically comes as a zip folder, and then you can unzip that folder and then place it in your user library essentially, and then those presets should be added to your library, and when you go to instruments and drift, there should be some of those presets there. But yeah, even if you just have them in a folder in your user library, then you can navigate to them, and there's 20 in there. So all of the sounds that were in that project are here. The names are probably slightly different than what they are in the video. And there's one extra bonus one, which is something, there was an article posted by Create Digital Music that was an interview with the actual designer of Drift, and there's a little kind of hidden Easter egg with the synth that if you use the second envelope to modulate the resonance, you can get the resonance to go higher than 1.01. So I did that to get some like gnarly acid sounds, because it's quite hard to get the extra resonance out of the synth. So I was very pleased to hear that that was actually possible. Yeah, so definitely try out those drift presets for yourself and let me know what you do with them. It'd be cool to hear some little previews or snippets of audio in either the Discord or in the discussion forum on Facebook. Yeah, I think what we'll do now is move on to the next segment. Huge thanks to Tim for putting this together for us. So yeah, sit back, enjoy, leave your comments, any questions in the comments, and Tim's in there, so he should be able to answer them for you pretty quickly as well. So let's get stuck in.
Have you ever wanted to explore the world of modular synthesis? Maybe you've already experimented with software modular environments such as VCV Rack, Reactor Blocks, or Cherry Audio Voltage Modular. Maybe you even have a full case of Euro Rack modules, or maybe you find the whole idea a bit complicated and daunting. One thing is for sure, modular synthesis has never been more popular. Although modular synths date back to the birth of commercial electronic musical instruments in the 1960s, they've experienced a renaissance in recent years, driven by the Eurorack hardware format and software emulations of it. One of the explanations for this resurgence is that modular synthesis offers fresh sounds, techniques, and ways of thinking about composition that break from the conventions infused into DAWs such as Ableton Live. However, these new possibilities can seem out of reach for many. The hardware can be complex and expensive, and even software emulations such as VCV Rack have a steep learning curve and can be difficult to integrate into a DAW-based workflow. Fortunately, Ableton Live, especially Live Suite, is a very deep and flexible environment. With the right knowledge and some thinking outside the square, you can use Ableton Live as a modular synth in its own right, one with its own character and quirks. Let's look at how mindsets and techniques from the world of modular synthesis can be used with Ableton Live native devices and Max for Live to broaden your sound palette and inspire creative new possibilities. Before we get into the details, let's quickly go over what modular synthesis is in the first place, where it came from, and what makes it still interesting today. All synths, modular and non, consist of multiple logical components connected together, fundamentally oscillators, filters, amplifiers, LFOs, and envelopes, plus sometimes keyboards, sequencers, or effects. The specifics vary from synth to synth, and the overall arrangement of components and their connections is sometimes referred to as the architecture of the synth. When the field of analog synthesis was new and very experimental, these components were often inspired by scientific laboratory equipment. Modular systems such as the Moog synthesizer and Buchla Modular provided a set of these components as individual modules, along with a cabinet to place them in and supply power to them. The connections between the components are made using patch cables, connecting jacks on the front panels of each module, allowing the player to configure any architecture desired. These early systems were often quite large, expensive, and suited only to studio use. Standards for the size, voltage ranges, patch cable connector types, and power requirements for modules varied from one manufacturer to another, so it was generally not possible to create systems with modules from multiple manufacturers in these days. As synthesizers became more popular amongst musicians in the 60s, not just experimental and academic musicians, but popular touring bands such as The Doors, The Who, and The Beatles, there was a need for a more portable synth format, and it became clear that some synth architectures are far more popular and musically useful than others. The Mini Moog set the template for most modern synth design, a fixed set of components with hardwired connections between them, hidden behind a unified control panel with an integrated keyboard, pitch bend, and modulation wheels. This style of synth, called a fixed architecture synth, quickly came to dominate the landscape. By the 80s, bulky and expensive modular systems became practically unknown. This began to change when the boutique German synth manufacturer Doepfer released the A100 compact modular synthesizer system in 1995, based on a new module format the company developed called Eurorack. Other manufacturers followed suit, developing modules compatible with the Eurorack standard for use within Doepfer systems, igniting a resurgence of interest in modular synthesis. By today, Eurorack has become a de facto industry standard for interoperation between modular and semi-modular synths. Dozens of manufacturers are producing thousands of Eurorack-compatible modules. This has led in turn to new software emulations of Eurorack systems, most notably the open-source VCV Rack environment, but also offerings from Cherry Audio, Native Instruments, and Softube, as well as both hardware reissues and software emulations of the pioneering Moog and Buchla systems. Let's look at some of the attributes of modular systems that have attracted modern musicians and explore how we can recreate them using native features of Ableton Live. The first and most obvious use of a Eurorack modular system is to design a custom instrument, combining components from multiple manufacturers. With a fixed architecture synth, all decisions about the number and types of oscillators, filters, envelopes, and other components are made by the designer. Maybe you've always wanted to use the filter from a Korg MS-20 with a Roland Juno 106 oscillator, or design a sound combining a harmonically rich digital wavetable sound with a weighty analog sub, or stack 6 detuned sawtooth oscillators to create a massive lead. In hardware, this can be difficult to do outside of a modular system. Software synths often have much more built-in flexibility, but sometimes you still want more. Ableton co-developed several analog model filter algorithms with a company called Cytomic and made them available in the operator, sampler, simpler, and wavetable instruments, but other instruments such as analog don't have the Cytomic filters available. Fortunately, the Cytomic filter designs are also available in the separate auto filter audio effect. By disabling the built-in filter in analog, we can use auto filter instead and select our choice of filter model. I like the SMP model, especially with some drive and resonance. A static filter frequency sounds pretty lifeless though. Movement is the key to effective sound design. The filter in analog has a dedicated envelope we can use to get a pronounced filter sweep effect. How can we get a similar effect with autofilter? It offers a built-in envelope follower that allows the filter frequency to respond to the level of incoming audio, but it's a blunt tool and lacks the decay phase of a typical ADSR envelope. In a modular system, modules include not only sound generators such as oscillators and audio processors such as filters, but also modulation sources such as envelopes and LFOs. These generate output called control voltage, which can be patched to control inputs on other devices, such as the filter frequency and resonance on a voltage-controlled filter, or VCF. Ableton Live also offers modulation sources as separate devices. They can be mapped to any control that supports automation, which can be thought of as Live's equivalent of control voltage. The modulators were developed using Max for Live, but starting with Live 11, several of them are available in Live Standard as well as Suite, even without a full Max for Live license. In this patch, we can use the envelope MIDI device to trigger an ADSR envelope with a moderately slow attack and decay, adjust the slopes to taste, and then map it to the frequency control on the auto filter. Now we have a nice, slow filter sweep on each press of a note. In a modular synth, not only do you have your choice of components, but you can also route audio and control voltage signals between them however you like, and can use modules called multiples or stacking patch cables to send the same signal to several destinations. The modulator devices in Live also offer the ability to control multiple parameters, and rack devices give us options for splitting and mixing audio within a processing chain. Returning to our filter sweep sound, the resonance gets a bit piercing as the frequency moves into the top of its range. I'd like it if the resonance could decrease a bit as the frequency increases. The button in the upper right of the envelope MIDI device shows the multi-map browser, allowing us to map the same modulation source to multiple destinations with different minimum and maximum values, which can be reversed to invert the direction of modulation. In this configuration, when the envelope level and filter frequency go up, the resonance goes down. Using a separate modulator device instead of the synth's built-in LFOs and envelopes also gives us the ability to use different modulation shapes. Like envelope MIDI, the built-in shaper MIDI device triggers when notes are played and offers several predefined modulation shapes. The ability to draw our own shapes, or even generate random shapes that can then be customized. If you're watching closely, you might notice a bug. As of Live 11.2.7, the latest version available as I record this, the shaper MIDI device triggers when a note is released, as well as when it's pressed. While I hope Ableton will fix this soon, we can work around it using another modulation mapping. Add an envelope MIDI device with the shortest possible attack, decay, and release times, and maximum sustain. Disable velocity and map it to the device activator button on the shaper MIDI device. This creates something called a gate in modular synthesis, a modulation that holds at a maximum value for a period of time, such as while a key is held on a keyboard, and resets to 0 when the key is released. Gates can then be used to control parameters of other modules. In this case, it turns on the shaper effect when a note is held, and turns it off when released. The shaper MIDI device can also be looped, turning it into a custom LFO shape. There are also LFO and shaper audio effects which run freely rather than being triggered by MIDI notes, as well as an envelope follower that controls parameters based on the level of incoming audio, much like the auto filter's envelope controls, but mappable to any automatable parameter, just like the other modulator devices. Other than allowing us to add different types of filters, envelopes, and LFOs to your synths, this modular approach can expand to the number of them used in a patch to as many as your CPU can handle. You can stack oscillators too by grouping your instrument into a rack, duplicating the chain, and changing the parameters to suit, or even substituting another instrument entirely. By using an external filter device instead of the synth's built-in filters, there's also the possibility of adding additional processing between the oscillators and the filters to further color the sound. Creative use of racks gives you the equivalent of audio patch cables, allowing you to route the sound into several parallel processing chains and mix them or pan them to add stereo width. The rack chain parameters can also be modulated. Here we map a slow-moving sine wave LFO to continuously adjust the panning of each chain in opposite directions. This patch is already getting pretty complex, but let's send it to a return track with an echo device on it to give more of a sense of space. In fact, we can modulate that send amount too, using the same slow LFO. With another inverted mapping, we can crossfade between two send amounts to make the effect even more eerie and surreal. As we've seen, parameter modulation is a key technique in modular style synthesis. Using the modulator devices in Ableton Live gives us a more flexible routing options than the LFOs and envelopes built into each instrument. With the shaper and shaper MIDI devices, we can create custom modulation shapes. There's another way to get interesting and unique modulation shapes that's very common in modular synthesis: modulating the parameters of the modulator devices themselves. Let's return to our simple analog bass and auto filter patch and delete the envelope MIDI and shaper MIDI devices. We'll add an LFO device to modulate the frequency instead. Now we'll add a second LFO and set that to modulate the sync rate of the first LFO between 8th notes and 12th notes every half bar to get a classic dubstep style wobble bass effect. We can try out different shapes, or set the first LFO time mode to operate in hertz instead of beat divisions to get a smooth transition between different rates. Why stop there? Another common technique in modular synthesis is cross-modulation, not only using LFO2 to control LFO1's rate, but also using LFO1 to control the rate of LFO2 in a feedback cycle. Let's open up the multi-map browser on LFO1 and map it to the rate of LFO2. For an even more dramatic effect, we can reduce the depth on LFO1 and multi-map LFO2 to its offset. Let's add a third LFO to the mix. LFO3 can modulate the depth of LFO2. While LFO1 modulates its depth. And let's say the offset of LFO2 as well. We can add other parameter mappings to each LFO and take this as far as we'd like. We've looked in detail at modulator devices and audio effects, but have glossed over the audio generation source itself. Oscillators in Ableton Live are quite different from their modular equivalents. They're really only available as part of an instrument device, and that makes them inextricably linked to MIDI. The pitch an oscillator plays at is mainly determined by a MIDI note value, and the oscillators are hard-coded to an internal amplifier that only allows audio out of the device while a note is held. In contrast, a modular oscillator, often referred to as a voltage-controlled oscillator, or VCO, is a much simpler device. It plays constantly at a normalized level. Making it quieter or turning it off requires patching its audio through a voltage-controlled amplifier, or VCA, usually controlled by a gate or an envelope. The pitch that it plays at, like every other parameter in a modular system, is determined by control voltage sent from another module or external device, often a sequencer or CV-compatible keyboard such as the Arturia keystep, but potentially any source of control voltage, including LFOs, random voltage generators, and more. That last fact is what I think makes it most interesting. To be honest, for most common musical purposes, MIDI is very suitable and familiar. With a modular system, it can actually be quite difficult to get it to play in a Western 12-tone scale. Specialized modules called quantizers are needed to snap control voltage values to the standard pitches. But this limitation is also its strength. With the infinite possibilities of continuous pitch control, you can easily design sounds that aren't specifically musical, and even tap into new forms of music in the spaces between MIDI notes. How can we achieve this in Ableton Live? One option is available in the operator instrument. We'll disable all oscillators except A and set it to fixed mode. In fixed mode, the oscillator will ignore the note number of incoming MIDI and play at the frequency set at the left. This can then be modulated by any of Live's modulator devices. I'll use an LFO set to random mode and a 16th note rate. Now when I hold a MIDI note on my controller, I get randomly chosen tempo-synced pitch changes for a classic techno or electro effect. Rather than spanning the entire frequency range, including many inaudible frequencies, we'll adjust the depth and offset to focus on mid-range tones. It sounds pretty good already, but I'd like it if there were some silence between each pitch with a snappy envelope that gives me control over the release time for variation. We can create something like a VCA by using the utility device and mapping its gain control to an envelope MIDI device set to sync mode. Be sure to set its maximum value to 50% to avoid blasting your ears. We can disable velocity and sustain and turn the sustain and release values all the way down. We only need the attack and decay stages. The release shape can be set to an exponential curve for an even snappier sound. Now the release time or even the overall time control can be modulated to add tension and release as it plays. Another way to get a similar effect that is also used in modular hardware is called filter pinging. This uses a resonant filter as a sound generation source by sending a click or blast of noise into it, often a modular trigger signal from a clock or sequencer, with the resonance set high enough to self-oscillate. We can use the auto filter again to do this. And in this case, we have to use one of the cytomic filter models, as the clean filter does not self-oscillate. I like using the OSR filter in bandpass mode. Set frequency to something in the middle, crank up the resonance to 100% or greater, and put any clicky sound in front of it. The drum synth hi-hat will do. Once you play the sound into the auto filter, it will generate a tone at the filter frequency that keeps playing continuously, just like a modular oscillator, as long as the resonance stays above 100%. Now you can modulate the filter frequency using any modulator device or even the auto filter's built-in LFO. I'll do that, again choosing a random shape. Turning on the quantize button can make it a little less chaotic. Auto filter also offers a stereo-separated random LFO option, something you can't do with an external modulator. Of course, we can add more modulators to make the sound even more interesting. Let's put a few of these ideas together to recreate a well-known modular patch. The bouncing ball comes from the manual for Make Noise Maths, one of the most popular Eurorack modules. Might not be something you would use in a musical context unless you're Aphex Twin, but it is a good example of using modular synthesis for sound design purposes. To build the patch in Ableton Live, we'll start with an operator. Disable the filter, set voices to 1, turn the volume slightly up, and disable all of the oscillators except for A. Set that to a fixed frequency of 300 Hz for now, and turn velocity down to 0%. Place a utility device after it. We'll use this again as a VCA. Now we'll need 2 envelope MIDI devices, a slower one and a faster one. Start by adding the slower one. Turn off velocity and sustain, set the attack, sustain, and release amounts all the way to their minimum values, and set the decay to 5 seconds. Then duplicate that device and set the copy to loop mode. Map the first envelope to the decay of the second one, and adjust the range to 25 to 40%. Now map the second envelope to the utility gain with the maximum set to 50%. Now hold a note using a MIDI controller or the computer MIDI keyboard. It's starting to sound like a bouncing ball, but we can tweak this to improve the effect. The original Maths version patches things so that the looping of the second envelope stops when the first envelope ends, while this one keeps repeating for as long as the note is held down. The equivalent with envelope MIDI would be to set the loop mode to free, but because there's a sync mode in between loop and free, automating loop mode with the first envelope won't work the way we want. Instead, we can set the first envelope to automate the on-off switch for the oscillator, silencing it once the envelope hits 0. Finally, I'd like to add a bit of frequency modulation to the oscillator with the second envelope to make it sound bouncier. Now that we've gone over several techniques for using modular style patching in Ableton Live, I want to quickly mention a few limitations to keep in mind. The first is that modular approaches don't always work well with polyphony, playing multiple notes simultaneously. Although Live's instrument devices have a limited number of filters, LFOs, and envelopes in each synth, they are duplicated per voice and can operate independently. The envelope MIDI and shaper MIDI devices are monophonic and re-trigger if you play additional notes while one note is held. Effects placed after the instrument, such as autofilter, of course operate on the mixed output of all voices rather than each voice individually. Second, not all parameters in Ableton Live support automation and control with modulator devices. I'd love to be able to modulate the partials of an operator user-defined wave shape, or the warp mode parameters on an audio clip, but unfortunately it isn't possible. Third, you can't map a modulator device to its own controls. That might seem like a strange thing to try, but self-patching is a popular technique in modular synthesis. There is a workaround for this one. If you install the CV Tools pack from Ableton, the CV utility device can be used to mirror the shape of a modulator by mapping the modulator to one of its value parameters, and then map the CV utility back to the original modulator device. Finally, the biggest disappointment for me is the absence of audio rate modulation. In a modular synth, there's no fundamental difference between audio signals and control voltage signals. Patching audio outputs to control other parameters is a big part of the fun. I was hoping to find a way to do this in Live too, using the CV in device, another part of the CV tools pack, to convert audio to modulation. It's intended to be used with a DC-coupled audio interface to take control voltage from external hardware and convert it into modulation within Live, but you can also set its input to another internal track. Then you can map it to a parameter, for example, using a utility device to do amplitude modulation. It does work, kind of, but not at the audio sample rate set for the project. The CV-in device downsamples to 1 kHz, and internal smoothing in the implementation of many target parameters might affect this as well. So it's a lo-fi effect, but it can still be interesting. We're out of time, but there are a lot of ways to take these concepts further. Live Suite users have access to additional packs that provide more modulation possibilities. I've already mentioned the CV Tools pack. Although it's mainly intended to help integrate Ableton Live with external hardware, many of its devices are also quite useful for modular-style patching entirely within the DAW. The pack called Inspired by Nature by Dylan Baston has a unique vector map device that can create multiple interacting modulation shapes. And there are many more modulation devices available from the pack section of Ableton.com, from the community site maxforlive.com, and elsewhere. It's also a great way to start developing your own Max for Live devices. The Max environment is deeply inspired by modular synthesis itself, and building small and simple devices that can be combined with others in a modular way can be a great way to give yourself a distinctive sound. The main thing to take away is not the specific patches and devices we looked at here, but to explore connecting things in creative and experimental ways. Thanks for watching.
Awesome. Yeah, cheers for that, Tim. That was great. Be awesome if others could show their love in the comments as well for Tim. Thanks for putting that together. I'll also mention again that, yeah, if anyone wants to, we would love to hear people get in touch with us and have them present content as well. It could be literally anything. Generally, for the live stream stuff, we're looking for things around 20 to 30 minutes worth of content so that we can have a similar kind of setup as this, 3 presentations and then some time for interim stuff and questions at the end. So yeah, if you do have any questions, we should still have some time at the end of the stream to answer some of those. Yeah, I think that's about it. The next video is me going through building Max devices, which is a new pack, free for everyone, from the Ableton pack store. I would love to go into more detail about Max stuff at some point. So let me know kind of what you're most interested in building with Max perhaps, and then we can kind of talk about going further down that route. Yeah, and if you've ever got any questions about any of my own devices, then hit me up. I'll probably do a presentation on those at some point because I haven't yet. But yeah, building Max devices. I hope you dig this one. Keep throwing your questions in the comments, and yeah, enjoy. Hey peeps, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be going through the new Ableton Live pack, building Max devices. My apologies, I do have a bit of a cold at the moment, but I was running out of time to get this presentation sorted, so here we are. I'll probably keep this video a little bit more brief than what I would have liked, but I'm still going to give you an overview of the pack, how to use it so you can get up and running faster, and how you might use the package for further exploration. When releasing this package, Ableton put together a really good playlist that talks more in depth about Max, Max for Live, and using this package. For those of you that don't know what Max is, the first video in the playlist is great, and I will be sharing this PDF with everyone, so these links will be available to you. So before I get into why building Max devices is cool, I'll talk a little bit about what it is. Building Max devices is a free package from the Ableton Live pack store. It does require Live 11.2 and above, either Suite or standard with Max for Live add-on. And it's a series of devices that can be used straight away without delving into programming in Max at all. But its main function is a series of lessons that teaches you all the fundamentals of programming in Max for Live. And it shows Ableton's dedication to the Max for Live concept, which is a strong one that makes it one of the most unique DAWs out there. I'm a Max for Live developer myself, and that makes up a very large part of my business. And I was very excited to see this package released. So straight away, I wanted to do a video that could help people get more out of the pack. So this is why I think building Max devices is cool. First of all, you learn by doing. Normally when people ask me about how to learn Max for Live and making their own devices using Max, I'll often say start with a task and then problem solve along the way using the documentation that is within Max. And that really is the best way, because you can't learn everything about Max straight away. And any course is always going to break things down into smaller parts. And that's what you're doing when you create yourself a project in Max and just figure out things along the way and slowly learn more and more as you build more and more things using Max. A lot of the time it happens a lot faster than you think. But now you've got pretty much a structured course on learning how to develop your own Max for Live devices. And you do that by creating Max for Live devices. Now the instructions are very easy to follow, and I'll show you how they kind of lay out their instructions and how you do follow along with them. Things are broken down very simply, which makes it applicable to all skill levels. It allows more advanced users to kind of jump the gun a little bit and move ahead a lot faster, but it also makes it really simple for beginners to really take their time and take everything in with very simple steps. As I mentioned, you can use the devices on their own. You don't have to do any programming in Max if you don't want to. There is a bunch of devices that can be used, some of them quite unique. So even if you have no interest in making your own Max for Live devices, you could use this package just to learn a bit more about Max and the concept of programming Max for Live devices, and then simply use all the devices that are on offer. Another reason why this is cool is that the lessons don't need to be done in order. If I jump on over to my browser and come to packs and building Max devices, we can see that there's 4 parts to the pack. And in the lessons, there are a total of 7 lessons. Now you could quite easily jump in here and just focus on the lessons that are of particular interest to you rather than following through the whole lot. Although it is recommended, as the lessons are kind of structured to show you different parts of programming using Max. But if all you want to do is control something in Live, then you could have a look at this Ableton Live set, or perhaps you want to make your own instrument, you could do this lesson here. The choice is yours. Beyond the already built Max for Live devices and the lessons, there's also a huge library of examples categorized into audio effects, controlling live, instruments, MIDI effects, routing, and even visuals. And as you can see, there's a bunch of different examples. So if I go plate reverb and then devices, there's a fantastic reverb example here that you could modify or copy and paste into your own devices to add further functionality to something you've already got. So it's a very well thought out package, covers a lot of ground. And as I mentioned, I'll show you how to follow along with the lessons and how you might combine some of the examples to make something new. So the 4 different parts are the tour, which basically gives you an example of the types of devices you can build in Max. The second part is the introduction, which is a step-by-step guide on how to access and modify Max devices from within Live. And inside this lesson are some nice simple devices that we can edit and modify, which we'll do a bit later. And I've talked about the lessons in the examples. Here I've loaded up the tour. I'm just going to close my browser window. Now you can see the information loads up in the lesson panel here, which is also called the help view. So you can access that by going view help view, and that'll bring that up. If you do lose this, then you can just reload the live set and this will pop back up, and you simply read through it and it'll provide you with some instructions to kind of follow along. But this one is just talking about each of the devices on each track, and that's kind of how the lessons are structured. So the 6 different devices that are in this first part is the filler device, which is basically a note repeater with probability. The second is a audio effect called snipper, which is basically a granular delay with pitch shifting, which is Really awesome, and definitely one of the ones that I could see myself using outside of the lessons of this package. Third one is a basic FM instrument called bell tower, which is the instrument that you'll make in the instrument lessons. Then there's a macro knob, which basically gives you one dial that you can map to multiple parameters, like you would a macro in a rack. Then there's a launcher device, which allows you to select which clips are playing using a dial, and then also randomize the playback. Then there's the last device, sidechain modulator, which allows you to use a signal to control a parameter. And these are basically the different types of devices that you can build using Max for Live. MIDI effects, audio effects, instruments, remote control or controlling live, things that access the Live API, which is the application programming interface. Basically, it's a way of querying Live for information, but also changing information within the application. And you can do that with all sorts of information in Live. And then also routing, which is again one of the really powerful things with Ableton Live, is the ability to route things everywhere. And yesterday, there was actually a new package released by Cycling74, the developers of Max, called AUGA014, 1.5, which makes some improvements on routing things in Live and provides examples of routing that you could either use straight away for multi-channel panning or simply use the examples in your own devices. We'll probably do a video on multi-channel and surround sound stuff at some point through Ableton User Group Adelaide. So let's check out this first live set and the devices that are on each track. So I'll hit play on the first scene and solo this. So this is filler. This is the beat repeat type thing. So if I turn down the dry chance and turn the wet chance up and change this to 16th notes, you get a bit of an idea of what it does. So it basically takes all the incoming notes, and when you turn on the fill button, it will create probability of the notes that are stored in there being played back while that's enabled. So pretty cool device for some quick little fills. Then there's the snipper. So this one I really like. If we turn down the random and turn up the size, turn up the dry wet, it sounds a lot like a delay. But then we add in some random, it starts sounding more granular. And then we can add pitch shifting as well. And now it is starting to sound more like the grain delay. It's really cool. With lots of reverb, this can sound really good for quite ambient washes and things like that. Really cool device. This is the kind of device that if you were quite good at Max programming, you could take this concept and perhaps make it multiple voices. So at the moment it's only a single delay. But what if you made this like 16 voices? Then it would be a really cool granular delay. So a great device to use on your own without doing any Max programming. Then we've got bell tower. So this is a FM instrument. It's almost like a simplified version of operator. Then we've got this macro knob. And we can see that it controls multiple parameters. And those parameters could be anywhere in your live set. They don't have to be on the one track. And you'll see in the final result live set that they provide, they use these macro knobs quite heavily to basically make a track completely performable using only 4 dials, which is pretty cool. Then there's the launcher. So what this is doing is, if we have a look at these clips and then go to launch, these clips are in legato mode. What that means is that when another clip is triggered, it will pick up where the last one left off. And the global quantization is set to quarter notes. Say this is 1 bar, and we trigger on the second beat another clip. That second clip will pick up from the second beat. So that helps with this launcher so that it can chop and change and pretty much combine different parts of each of these clips to create melodic variation within this sound, which is very cool. And I might just change this rate. So let's go to 1. So it'll continually chop and change the different parts. This could be a pretty interesting composition idea. Then the last one, this is the sidechain modulator here, and it's using the volume of the bass and the volume of the piano to turn down the filters and modulation on the pads. So if I solo, so you can see that when the bass plays, it kind of gets muted a little bit. So pretty cool. So here I've got the introduction lesson loaded up, and I just wanted to show you how you follow along with the lessons. So you can see that each track is labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you would basically go from track to track and edit each Max for Live device by clicking the edit button on a Max for Live device. And then it has these little comments that you can follow along with. So it says switch to patching. So if we click this, it'll switch it to patching mode and out of presentation mode. And then we follow these comments. So the second comment says Max supports live UI objects. Open the help patch from this style's right-click menu to see how it can be customized. So we can right-click and go open live dial help. Give us some information there. Then it says choose add to presentation from the right-click menu. So we can right-click it, go add to presentation. And then it says switch back to presentation mode, move the dial, and then save the device. And there you've completed that particular task in this project. My little tip for programming in Max, I'm just going to hit play here. In Max, if you go up to debug and enable event probe and signal probe, then you get these little bits of information that pop up when you hover over a connection. And they can be super useful for figuring out what's happening inside your Max patch. So I don't see that mentioned in the lesson, so it's definitely a good idea to enable. It's super simple to use and can help you figure out what might be going wrong if you are patching in Max. So in a moment, let's do some Max patching of our own, and we'll use this introduction lesson to add some more features to the devices that are in this particular live set. But there's some other ideas that you can try as well. So in the examples, all the devices there are basically a device without a user interface. So you can change the way that the user interacts with the effect or instrument or whatever it is. So for example, there's a delay in the audio effects examples. So you could modify that to add a user interface to that example device. Then going beyond that, there's other devices in the examples part of the Ableton Live pack, such as the grain cloud instrument, which you could perhaps turn into an audio effect, which is something that I tried quickly and got a kind of cool result. But perhaps you could also incorporate that with the snipper audio effect from the lessons and the plate reverb from the examples as well into the ultimate granular processing unit. Obviously, that's going to be for a lot more advanced Max for Live programmers, but it gives you a bit of an idea of further possibilities with this pack. So let's try these first two. We're going to take the octave adder and then add some functionality from one of the example devices. And then we'll also look at the noise adder and how we can make that stereo and add some filtering to the noise. So here I am in the introduction lesson again. I'm just going to close this lessons panel or help view. And on this second track is the octave adder. And we're going to add the humanization functions from an example device into this device to give it some more variation and musicality. So in part 4 examples, MIDI effects, humanizer devices, then here's the humanizer device here. I'm going to pop that down here. I'll close my browser and I'm just going to click edit on the humanizer Max for Live device. This will bring up the patcher for this device. And we basically want to take this stuff here and put it in the octave adder device. So I'll just click and drag to select these objects, then right click and go copy, and then I can close this patcher. Now if we edit the octave adder device by clicking the edit button, we'll come out of patching mode And I'll just make this patcher window a bit bigger. Then we can paste the bits that we copied earlier and start to look at how we can integrate the humanizer functionality. So to start off with, I'm just going to lock this patcher. And then this object here starts with a P, which tells me that it is a patcher itself. So when I double click this, it'll reveal what's inside. And we can take a look at how we can combine these two concepts. So you can see that both start with a similar object. One is MIDI select and one is MIDI pass. And they both do pretty much the same thing. They allow you to take an incoming MIDI signal and separate it into its different bits of information. So if I come over to this patcher here and just unlock this again and hover my mouse over this outlet, it says that out of this outlet is a list that contains both pitch and velocity. And then the next object is an unpack object, which if we go to the reference panel here, it says it breaks a list into individual messages. So this separates the pitch and velocity into two streams of information. Then in this patcher, this is all the stuff that basically adds an extra note on top of the incoming MIDI note. So the octave adder will add a note that is 12 semitones above whatever is coming in. And this parameter controls the amount of notes that are added. In the humanizer, we've got a similar type of thing. This is the pitch information here. So there's a bit of patching here to add some randomization to the velocity. And then this object here delays the pitch and velocity information before packing it into a list for the MIDI format object. Now there are lots of different ways that we could combine these two concepts. But to keep it really simple, I'm just going to unlock this patch. I'm going to click this object and hold Shift and then drag this object away, and it breaks that connection. I'll delete that stuff, and I'll do a similar thing over here. Delete this, select this object, hold Shift, and then drag it out, and it removes it from within that connection. Now I can delete that object. So now we can basically slot this patcher in here after this pack object. Then within this patcher, it'll unpack it again, add the humanizer functionality, and then pack it into a list again before it comes into these flush, pack, and MIDI format objects. So let's lock this patcher here and close this one. And then I'm just going to break these connections here. So select the cables and hit delete. Then if I select this object, hold Shift and drag this over, we can slot it in here. And then we can reconnect these dials. Now I can move these objects over here, and with them selected, I'll right click and go add to presentation. So now we've added that functionality into the device, but while we're here, we might as well do what these comments are saying as well, which is basically to connect this object here to the unpack object. And that allows us to test the functionality when this parameter gets moved. So I'm going to lock the patcher again and then turn this. Now let's turn these dials up and see what happens. Cool, so we're getting more randomization in the timing of the notes and the velocity, which is great. So now when I switch to presentation mode and unlock this patcher, then I can place these dial objects somewhere up here above in the visible part of presentation mode. Then I'll lock this and hit freeze, which allows me to share the device with others, collecting all the information needed for this particular device to be shared, which is an unnecessary step if you're just keeping it on your own computer, but if you do plan on sharing it, is important. Now we can go File, Save As, and we can save it as octave adder with humanization. So now if we close this, and we can get rid of this one, and we can test it out. So let's hit play. Very cool. So that's combining two devices. Let's have a look at modifying one ourselves. So here on the fourth track, there is this noise adder. If I hit play, you can hear it's adding noise to the incoming signal. If I turn this down, so adding noise to a signal like this is actually a pretty cool way of adding texture and gluing sounds together. I have a device myself called Noisier, which does a similar thing. And the one we just made is actually quite similar to my chords device. But if we want to improve this noise adder here, we could do so by making it stereo. So at the moment, the noise is mono. And then rather than adding full range noise, we could remove the low end and maybe a bit of the top end from the noise. So it's a little bit more subtle effect and keeps the low end really nice and tidy and adds more body to the sound. So let's hit edit on this Max for Live device. Come out of presentation mode and into patching mode. And we'll make this patchy window a bit bigger again. Now we can see here, this is the noise object. So this is what's generating the noise. This stuff here is all to do with the envelope that controls the volume of the noise. So the output of the noise is being multiplied by this incoming envelope, which is what you saw on the display earlier. So how can we make this stereo? Easy. All we have to do is create another noise object, another multiply object, and then connect them to the separate outputs. So let's highlight both of these. Hold Option on a Mac and click and drag, or you could do copy and paste. And now we've got two of each. Then we can take this connection here. I'm going to grab this part of the connection, this little green dot, and drag that over to here. And then take this connection from here to here. And straight away, we've made this stereo. So if I lock this and hit play here, we can hear that that noise is now stereo. So with a very simple change, we've already made this device a lot better. Now let's take things a little bit further. I'm just gonna get rid of some of this stuff and make some room for what we're gonna do next. I'm gonna move both of these objects up here, and we wanna add some filters to the noise. So I'm gonna double click and it'll allow me to create a new object. I'm gonna start typing in one pole, which is a very simple filter. Then for the argument, which is the information you type after the name of the object, we'll define various things depending on the object. But it says here the first argument that we give it will be the center frequency, so the cutoff frequency of the filter. So for this, we'll do 10,000. So this is going to be a low pass filter on the noise and attenuate any information above 10 kilohertz. Now I'm also going to make another filter. So I'll double click again and go one pole. And this time around, I'm going to go 100 hertz. Now we can turn this one pole low pass filter into a high pass by doing a little bit of extra math. So if I add a minus signal, so this will subtract one signal from another, and I take the noise and subtract the output of this low pass filter from that, then it will basically give me the opposite of a 100 hertz low pass filter, which is a 100 hertz high pass filter. And then from there, we can add this 10 kilohertz low pass filter and then connect that to our multiplication object for controlling the volume of the noise. So I'm just going to copy all this stuff and paste it here. And let's make some more room for ourselves. Connect this stuff in here. Cool. Now let's hear that when I hit play. Cool, so we got some filtered noise happening now. And to hear the difference, let's just connect this back up here. Definitely brighter. Having it down here. Just a little bit more subtle effect. And obviously you could change the frequency of these filters by adding some information into this connection here. So now we're done with this device. We can lock this, go back into presentation mode. We don't have to change anything here. We can just go File, Save As, and then add Noise Adder, Stereo with Filters, 0.1. Close this, and now we've got our modified device. So there were some simple examples, but I've kind of remixed this introduction live set a little bit. I hit play. So what I've done is on a return track, I've added snipper, the delay from the examples. So if I go back to packs, examples, audio effects, delay, and if I show you what this device originally looked like, you can see that it looks like this, and I've basically given it a user interface. So that's one of the things I suggest people use as a bit of a task to learn more. So if I open this up, we can see that in presentation view, I've got a panel object, and I've just kind of moved things around, added these dials to presentation, so that way it looks kind of tidy. This is one of the things I mentioned earlier, taking the grain cloud instrument, which is in Instruments, Grain Cloud, Simpler, and I turned it into an audio effect. It's still got some bugs, but it produces a useful effect. If I solo this, and let's turn this off. So there's snipper and delay, and then with the grain cloud effect, it's basically sampling the incoming audio and then playing it back at a different rate with a lot of randomness and up to 16 snippets of audio. Then I'm applying a filter and using this plate reverb on the end. So turning the incoming signal into a nice wash of sound. If I turn it off and back on, and on solo, so hopefully that gives you some ideas of things you can try. Before we wrap up this video, there's just a couple more things I wanted to show you. So I've already mentioned the grain cloud, plate reverb, and that there's some video stuff in here, which I'll let you check out for yourself. But the instrument and debug lessons are pretty cool. And they're pretty cool because I can see a lot more MPE instruments and synths being made using these lessons as a foundation. But I thought it was also very good that they included a lesson on debugging, which simulates an issue with a device and explains how you might go about fixing it and how you might go about fixing other issues in your own devices later on. Some other cool things I think that are worth mentioning in the examples in instruments, there's even an explanation of what aliasing is, which is great, and it really shows the depth that this package goes into. Aliasing is a kind of nasty digital distortion that can happen when you're playing with digital audio processing. And this explains it quite simply in the context of instruments, but it can happen in all sorts of audio effects as well. The fact that they've included it means that following all these lessons and looking through all these examples, you're definitely going to be able to create quite well thought out devices if you use all the resources that are available in this pack. Another thing that's cool is that it has lots of examples for using Live's API and controlling Live. Now there is tons of stuff to explore here, and Max for Live is a great way of extending the functionality of Live itself. So as you can see, it's a pretty complete package. There's lots of different stuff that you can do with it, and I hope this video helps you get a little bit more out of it. Beyond using this pack to make your own Max for Live devices, there's resources like the Cycling 74 Max Discord, there's Facebook groups, and there's Cycling 74's forum, all of which are really good resources with people there very willing to help and will quite happily guide the way, overcoming any problems that might arise.
And obviously there's tons more examples of Max for Live devices at maxforlive.com. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.
Awesome. Yeah, I hope you dug that one, peeps. Would be great to see some devices developed by our community here. So yeah, please do share those with us, whether you want to message them to us and we can perhaps share them on Facebook or whatever, or if you want to share them yourself on Discord, whatever you so please. But yeah, the goal for us is definitely just to get more user content. So yes, we use this demo and Max for Live editing live suite. Yes, you have to have Max for Live. You have to have Live Suite or Max for Live Standard for the Building Max Devices pack to work. Yeah, and let us know if you want us to do a bit more stuff on Max for Live. There's all like unlimited amounts of things that we could show there. And I've obviously gone pretty deep down that route myself. But yeah, does anyone have any questions? We've got a little bit of time left. Yeah. Yes, thanks again to Tim for creating that presentation for us. Also, like, really open to feedback from everyone about ideas for future presentations, or just like different. What would be great is doing more kind of fun things together, rather than they're trying to be having a focus on this kind of content that we're shoving in your faces. It'd be great to just get more involved in like the music making practice together. So some little challenges and stuff like that. Yeah. So let us, remix competitions like Against the Clocks, things that perhaps we can do stuff like that online as well, rather than having to do those in person. Like we have done Against the Clocks in person before, but yeah.
Can I find you on Discord?
Yeah, absolutely. We are on Discord, and I'll share a link in there in a second, or if you want to do that for me, Justin, share the Discord link.
Yeah, also Gemma asked that she was under the impression that Max for Live in Live Suite was read only, but no, it's definitely right in there.
Yeah, no, 100%. If you have Max for Live, if you have Live Standard with a Max for Live add-on or Live Suite, then you get a license to Max for Live. So that means when you open the editor from within Live, the Max editor from within Live, you've got free reign of using Max. That includes saving devices, creating your own devices. There are some limitations that you get with that license. Things such as some of the MC objects and the gen objects, which go deeper, and they require an actual standalone license to Max. But there is tons that you can do with just the Max for Live license that you get with Live Suite. Yeah, you can go a long way with just that.
And definitely maxforlive.com.
Yeah.
It's great value.
Yeah, maxforlive.com if you want to see more examples. A great way to kind of get started with doing your own stuff is to, come up with an idea, assess what is already out there, and perhaps, skillfully thieve some ideas from others and adjust, change things to your liking. So there's lots of inspiration on maxforlive.com. Lots of great devices that, in that pack, and also on the pack store. And quite a lot of them you can edit them and have a look inside of them. So you can really, everything is there to allow you to create really interesting stuff. And Live able to know that, and they really push it. And Max for Live is a huge part of Live now, and they're only going to continue to make it more integrated with live and promote people to create their own instruments and effects.
About three.
Yeah, push 3. So obviously pretty huge announcement that Ableton made about the push 3. The stock has been kind of limited. I'm not sure who here in SA has got one yet. I haven't got my hands on one yet, although I did get to play with one thanks to Ableton before it was released. But yeah, we'll be talking to our rep and seeing what the deal is there, and hopefully get some down. But definitely a very interesting feature set. Yeah, so hopefully in the next kind of 2 or 3 months, I should have one for myself, and then we should also be able to organize another in-person user group session so that everyone else can get their hands on one and have a bit of a play, because the pads are sensational, and some of the features that are in there, like it being able to be standalone and the built-in audio interface. Yeah, there's the CV options, CV gate out. So total of like 4 CV outs basically that you can do with it. Yeah, and the expansion that you can do over ADAT. It's a very well thought out device, and it's only going to improve over time. That's a big thing that Ableton kept on, telling us, is that it's something that's going to continue to develop over the years to come. And it was like nearly 8 years for the push 2, so there's going to be at least another 8 years on the push 3, probably much longer, because the hardware is upgradable. So yeah, very, very cool announcement, and we'll definitely do some stuff on that. But yeah, any other questions before we wrap things up, perhaps? No? Cool.
Might leave it at that.
Yeah, so I'll just reiterate again, I've posted in the comments that the presentation files, so you get Tim's example project, there's 20 drift presets from me, and then there's a couple of PDFs, just some quick tips on drift, and my links and stuff for the Building Max Devices presentation. So it's all there in that publicly shared presentation files Google folder.
And you can watch the video back on YouTube later.
Yeah, you'll be able to watch this video back here on Facebook, and we will also post it to YouTube. Yeah, so we'll post all those links and stuff when they're available. And yeah, thanks a lot everyone for joining us. It's obviously it'd suck if we put in all this effort and had next to no one rock up. So yeah, thanks for joining us and engaging with us. And yeah, please stay in touch. Keep active and hit free to hit us up about anything really, and we'll keep the conversation going. So we'll leave it at that for now. Again, thanks everyone, and we'll see you again soon.